So good morning, everyone. Welcome back to our third days of this KOSMOS workshop. I hope you managed to rest a bit from last night. Yeah, just a short announcement for the one who are presenting their poster later. Remember to put it up, maybe during the first coffee break. Yeah. So let's start with today's first talk. It's a great pleasure to have here Ruth Herbert. Ruth, she's a music psychologist and lecturer, and she works at the University of Kent at the Center for Music and Audio Technology. Her research interests include the subjective experience of music in everyday life, music, health and well-being, music and consciousness, including altered states of consciousness and trance, and the evolutionary origins of music. And besides being a psychologist and lecturer, Ruth is also a performer. She's a pianist. And among other works, she has also recorded soundtracks for silent films commissioned by the British Film Institute. Today she'll be talking about musical daydreams and different types of consciousness. So please welcome Ruth Herbert.
Hi, everybody. I'd like to start with two takes on musical daydreams. These are separated by about a century, and both examples were included in a chapter I wrote for an edited volume on entrancement. This was edited by Ruth Finnegan. Let's go straight to those. The first one, just before I do that, perhaps it's one of the earliest empirical studies of music listening, so it's early 20th century. And the second example is an interview snippet from my own work on the phenomenology of everyday music listening. So at the top we see the early one. Listening to a symphony by Glazunov, I had the inner vision of an unknown landscape, a wild northern bay. Against this backdrop, I beheld the strangest apparitions, crowds of people dressed in red, also white horses, but also terrifying mythological beasts. So this is one of the participants in an early study prior to 1918, which was led by the writer Vernon Lee. Second example, quite different. You know, just before you properly wake up in the morning, you're not asleep, but you're not really back in the land of the living. Sometimes I can get like that with the music. It's taking you away somewhere, isn't it, David? The interesting thing here is both these experiences are dealing with an inwardly focused attention. So in Frau Maria's case, that centers on fantastical imagery. And in David's case, he's likening the process of musical daydreaming to a stage between sleep and wakefulness. This is sometimes called the hypnopompic state in hypnotherapeutic literature. Do musical daydreams always turn inwards in this way? And how are they interrelated with structural properties of music? And what is the function of these type of daydreams in everyday life? Well, in the years prior to World War I, Vernon Lee, who I've mentioned, compiled this early listening study. So this was a series of questionnaires and interviews, and it's not robust in today's terms, but it's quite interesting. So we have 150 participants from various countries. So we had Germany, Italy, France, and the UK. And Lee highlighted two different types of listening. She termed them listening and hearing. So, for listeners, the music is the central focus of attention, the central or sole focus of attention. This is what we would call autonomous listening. The listening of the hearers is quite different. It wasn't about the music solely. It was a multimodal interweaving of musical characteristics with extra musical detail. As we can see from here, moments of concentrated and active attention to the musical shapes are like islands continually washed over by a shallow tide of other thoughts. Memories, associations, suggestions, visual images, emotional states, they coalesce, forming a homogeneous and special contemplative condition. Musical phrases, non-musical images, and emotions are all welded into the same musical daydream. So Lee here identifies two characteristics, I think, of lived experiences of music. The first is this fluctuating distributed attention. So it's sometimes on the characteristics of music, and it's sometimes on extra musical associations. It fluctuates. And the second is a perceived move away from a baseline or normal state of consciousness. By that I mean a normal state of consciousness to the perceiver. So I've previously suggested that these type of interactions can usefully be framed as a form of musical trancing. So we have to be careful with the T word. It's all over the place and used in different senses. And I think that we will find, and we have found yesterday, that the same is true with the mind-wandering term. So by musical trancing, I'm using it in a sort of Wittgenstein sense of family resemblances way. So there's not one musical trance. There are different forms of trancing. Notice that I'm using it as a gerund, following Judith Becker. What we can say is that there's a decreased orientation to what we might term consensual reality. There's a reduced critical faculty, and there's a selective attentional focus. Trancing itself can be seen to have two processes within it broadly. One is absorption, which is this effortless involvement, which I know several of us are researching at the moment. And the other is dissociation, which would be a detachment from surroundings or self or activity. That's been far less researched. It's also useful to think of these experiences in terms of kinds of consciousness. So these experiences, marked with this distributed attentional focus and absorption and dissociation, we can also add on this notion of sometimes there might be an element of referencing phenomenal consciousness, so a direct sensory awareness, this engagement with attributes, sort of raw, ineffable qualities. The redness of an apple is an example that's often used when talking about these experiential qualia, and that was a term we heard yesterday when we visited the audio lab. Also, primary consciousness, their present-centered engagement, a core consciousness, and then this higher extended autobiographical awareness. And I'm drawing here on terms used by Damasio and Gerald Edelman. So Lee's listeners were clearly listening in a multimodal, heteronymous way. And interestingly, they admitted they wanted to hear music to get the imagery. Now, does this mean it's mind-wandering? It's clearly volitional. So this is, I'm just posing the question of how we describe this, if it is a volitional, habitual practice. I selected the Lee example for several reasons, but one of them was that it focused this study on classical music, where there is still the model, which only came in the 19th century, of autonomous listening. And because a good proportion of scholars in musicology still have backgrounds in classical music, this model does persist. And so it has meant that studies of multimodal listening have lagged a little bit. There's much more now. They're sort of under the research radar. I think thinking of experiences in terms of consciousness is also quite liberating because it frees us from the emotion paradigm, and it allows us to think in terms of processes such as unconscious perception and to examine temporality. Because an experience is processual, so we will have a fluctuation and maybe quite different things happening during it. So multimodal listening. This is something I talked about quite a lot in my book, Everyday Music Listening. That's now, it goes back to 2011. It's now out in paperback, quick promotion there, so half the price, and a lot of the things I talk about are referenced in there. So multimodal listening accords with an ecological approach to music listening. So that is listening as systemic. It involves the perceiver, the person doing the listening, including all their habituated ways of listening, their thoughts, their current state of mind, personality characteristics, and then that interacts with characteristics of the environment, and then that interacts with stimulus attributes of music. So music is mediating, it's not accompanying experience. And so really no experience of music can be autonomous. So in that case, are all experiences of music examples of mind wandering? Obviously not, that doesn't sound right at all. Crucially, I use the term multimodal listening to encompass mentation, meaning internally generated verbal stuff, non-verbal stuff, visual imagery, but plus sense impressions from the environment. So the interaction might be entirely an internal interaction with thoughts and characteristics of music, but it might be a fluctuating thing where attention is moving inwards and outwards in mind wandering. So an experiential blending. So this kind of distributed listening affords subtle shifts of consciousness precisely because it's multimodal. So in my book and in studies since then that I've carried out, you can really see how people's senses are being bundled together in their interactions with music. So we get experiences about listening, seeing, doing, imagining, tasting, and smelling. And of course, one reason why experiences of music in ritualistic contexts are so involving is because of this bundling together of different sensory impressions. And it's also interesting that when you, often when you experience, say, a hypnotherapeutic induction, the therapist will try and reference as many sensory modalities as possible. Obviously, the arts are incomplete as sensory stimuli, and so they encourage a performative stance to sense-making. So it's really not surprising that music affords imaginative involvement in the form of visual imagery and episodic memory, just to think of two of the psychological mechanisms proposed by Jocelyn. But is there something special or particular about music in that regard? Now, that was one of the questions I wanted to examine in some of my phenomenological work. So I compared musical experiences that appear to be involving with non-musical experiences. And in brief, thinking about the specialness of music, the answer was maybe, but more of that later. It is true, I think, to say that of all art forms, music appears to be particularly versatile as a means of customizing individual subjective experience across a broad range of scenarios. Why do I talk about mind wandering, not mind wandering, but multimodal musical daydreaming? And my mind is actually full of discussions we were having yesterday in our 2-hour block, and thinking a lot about this. Mind wandering is an established term in psychological literature. So Jerome Singer was a pioneer of research into daydreaming and imaginative involvement. He preferred the term daydreaming, as evident in his seminal book on the topic, which was 1966. And also interesting to note that his first PhD student was John Antrobus, and they together they created the imaginal processes inventory. I've found when doing my phenomenological study, which all my studies have centred on the use of music in everyday life, that I haven't been using the term mind-wandering. And I think that maybe is an acknowledgement of the interaction between self and environment and musical attributes, which I felt wasn't really captured by it, because wandering suggests a shift of attention away from music. It doesn't really tap, for me, the ways in which stimuli can be perceived to interact and to blend, to complement each other, maybe even counteract each other. So if we look at mind-wandering literature, and here I have a quote from Lila's recent study, there is often a focus on inwardly directed attention, as you can see here. The self-generated thought, overcoming the constraints of here and now, immersing in one's own stream of consciousness. Everyday listening episodes may absolutely be like this, but they're not necessarily like this. Here's another one. Again, internally generated thoughts here. So, thinking about terminology within mind-wandering, and this is coming out of yesterday's discussion, so it's a bit raw here. For people involved in studying the phenomenology of everyday music experiences, there are perhaps some things that are open to debate or maybe a bit puzzling. So just to go through those. Sometimes you get a sense that both daydreamings and mind-wandering are described as discrete states as opposed to processes. That there is an assumption that visual imagery experienced in conjunction with music is an example of mind-wandering and not simply random sort of just associations. Then you get the use of daydreaming and mind-wandering as synonyms. Conversely, you get different understandings of daydreams as internally focused, drawing on long-term memory, whereas mind-wandering is triggered by some sort of sensory reaction to something physical within the self or something social or environmental. And then also the idea of music accompanying experience in some way. So sure, music may provide an inductive platform for mind-wandering, but there are also experiences where there is an interaction between stimulus attributes and the sorts of mentation that come to mind. And perhaps too, and perhaps this is contentious, that mind-wandering has a whiff of Western industrialized bias to it, because it suggests that we're somehow going away from our linear focus on the task we're supposed to be on. And this is the same bias that allows detachment, whether you frame it as mind-wandering, daydreaming, or dissociation, to be pathologized. So I think Jerome L. Singer's wonderful achievement, one of them, was to make daydreaming seem a normative, positive process. And it's interesting that recent scholarship indicates this is happening in the case of dissociation. If you look at the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, you can see there are now normative constructions of dissociation, which is great. So those are just a few thoughts about that. Before I go on to that, so visual imagery research with mind-wandering, and this is not my territory actually. I'm kind of dipping into it, of course I am, but it's not my main field of research. It's focused a lot on function, frequency, adaptive, maladaptive potential, relationship between visual imagery and stimulus attributes, and valence of music and neural correlates such as the default mode network. So there's been less focus, I think, on the phenomenology of mind-wandering or musical daydreaming. So what I'll do now is I'm going to take examples from various research projects. So most of this is qualitative data, okay? It's interviews and diary data. But there's also one study that I carried out, a lab-based study with Nikki Dibbin from Sheffield. And what we did was use experimenter-selected excerpts. So we took 20 excerpts and presented them to an awful lot of young people to ask various questions about that. I'll tell you about that in a minute. First, let's go to visual listening. So this comes from the qualitative studies. It's very, very common. So visual listening, it includes internal imagery, but also this experiential blending between images and environment. It's very common for young people, actually, as sort of digital natives. A lot of their musical encounters are inherently multimodal. And it's also very common for people that work with images, as in the case of Max, who works doing sound for film. In fact, I think Max did the soundtrack for a lot of the Wallace and Gromit films. And I was interested because he couldn't believe that nobody would experience images to music. And a lot of people don't. If you have an emotional response to music, it will lead to images, whether you like it or not, he said. And this is one of his experiences of listening to a Shostakovich symphony. Just let you look at that for a moment rather than reading it. So clearly, he's responding to musical characteristics and extra musical associations. And the listening is performative, it's not passive, it seems quite absorbed at times. I think there's also a conflict, a sort of change of things in here, because you get the emotional pain side of it, but then this tangential thought, wandering off, thinking about Shostakovich's appearance, the Bakelite glasses, and wondering about the relationship between composers' appearances and the music. So we can see how the experience is fluctuating. Well, let's think about this experience in terms of kinds of consciousness. So this clearly references an extended consciousness. So there's an autobiographical sort of memory element coming in here, long-term memory. Self-aware. And actually, a lot of the reports indicated that these kind of experiences that people had with visual imagery were particularly common when travelling, these routine gaps of time, which leads me into function. I don't think that this experience is future-focused, and I don't think it's about creativity. I think it's much more a zoning out and much more about self-regulation. I'm now going to the Young People in Music study. So this is the experimenter-selected extracts. Quite different. This is probably quite tiny, but this shows you the range of extracts we chose. Why did we do this? Because actually this seems quite old-fashioned in some ways and not sort of ecologically valid. One reason it worked was it was part of a mixed method 3-year project. So it was complemented by qualitative data, etc., which we'll see a bit of. What we wanted to do was to find out how young people made sense of music, and we wanted to find out whether that changed across pre-pubescence into early adolescence and late adolescence, because actually a lot of musical research doesn't focus on those sort of mid-adolescent years. Because we work in universities, we tend to use a student population quite a bit, and then there's a whole literature on early musical development. So there's a little bit of a gap in the middle, apart from work on open-earedness. So we were interested to see whether there was a consensus in terms of the imagery and the meanings that came out of these excerpts. And we also wanted to see the relationship between perceived and felt emotion and the impact of age and training. I'm really throwing this out here because for debate, because you could say, that it's not an example of mind wandering at all. That what the young people are doing is listening to music and then responding with just brief snapshot associations. The trigger for this was just an open text box where we tried to make it as vague as possible and said just write down words, reactions that come to mind. So intentionally very, very vague. Thinking about the length of excerpts, the longest in this study was 30 seconds. So this may well affect the whole experience when we're doing experimental selected excerpts in studies. I think in Leela's study, some of the excerpts were up to 2.5 minutes. Yeah. And in another study, Mattarelli, I think some of the excerpts were over 5 minutes. So that's going to mean something quite different. And also, the more you prime a task, maybe the more likely you're going to get an associative response. Let's go to some of these. So, I'm going to give you this example here, and what we're dealing with here is 10 to 12-year-olds, visualizations, and my God, they visualized a lot to music. This just seemed to be a response that was very, very natural. Here we have reactions to different things. Now, just to explain, so in the brackets where you see R, that's the first extract, which is a film music extract. And where you see V, that is a violin concerto. So, see if it works. Film. That's the first one. That was our longest extract. I didn't play all of it, but that lasted half a minute. And then if we go to the violin concerto. Okay, the Beethoven Violin Concerto. And we can see a consensus then. We've got things around a sort of generic affluent past. We've got royalty and fairy tales. We've got nature and outdoors. And we've got older people. This is familiar, isn't it? So the violin piece is a piece for an elderly person's birthday. But some consistency of imagery there. Sorry. Oops, got stuck. Okay. Oh, it's fine. Okay. So, just going back, one of the interesting things with the extracts we found was that a lot of the 10 to 12-year-olds engaged in a kind of self-in-scenario visualization. So this frequently centered on a sort of powerful future self. And the most common scenarios were performing or listening to music, because some of the people came from specialist music schools. I should have said, actually, that with the cohort, we selected from primary and secondary state UK schools. So those are non-selective. We had a cathedral school, and then we had specialist organisations. So things like the Purcell School in the UK, and things like National Youth Jazz Orchestra. So because we had some specialist musicians in the project, we did have fantasies about imagining themselves being famous performers, obviously. Protagonist in adventures, observer in historic settings, and romance. And I think, let's try this one. that's really quite obvious. We can immediately see how those links are made and how young people are really familiar with a variety of musical codes. What was quite interesting is some of the different source specifications that came up in this study. So let me just play this very brief extract. Okay. The top example is from a specialist musician. I think it's a Purcell School of Music person who has the Cathedral Association, and we can see in the description and the thinking about music the effect of training, in that there's talk of Dorian modes, for instance, and terms like unison. But then, if you look at the experience below, you can see a quite different reference point. So this is interesting in terms of visual imagery and music. So this person's reference point is maybe films, maybe Harry Potter, I think. And then, really, yeah, I don't know whether we've got another one down there. No, we haven't. There was another one. A computer game was the other reference for that, which we found quite interesting. Of course, these are experimenter selected excerpts, and as I've said, they maybe don't constitute mind wandering or daydreaming at all. So let's go out into the real world and have a look at self-chosen music, which I think is an enormously important area in terms of music and mind wandering, daydreaming. So this, again, it's part of the same multi-method study, which was a 3-year study. And these experiences were reported either in interviews or in self-reflective diaries that were compiled over a 2-week period. And what I'm doing here is I'm looking at the way imagery changes or appeared to change for young people in this study. Okay. So I'm sorry about this long extract on the screen. You can see that I've put X's in there because I'm curious to know, when I use this extract when talking, people sometimes come up with quite different ideas about what the music might be and what the age of the young person is. So just looking at that, I wonder if we've got any idea, thinking of the 10 to 18 range, of what age of person we're looking at. So we divided this age range into 3. So we have the 10 to 12, and then we have the mid-adolescents, sort of 13 to 15, and then we have 16 to 18. So the offers for 13 to 15, could we even do hands up for that? Who thinks it's a 13 to 15-year-old? Just a few. Okay. So a 10 to 12? More people. And a 16 to 18? Wow. Wow. What about the music? What sort of music is this? I'm aware of time, so I'm not going to go through this. So Lily is 11 years old. So again, we can see how the relationship immediately between some of those associative codes in music and her imaginings. And we can also see the use of something Philip Tagg, the semiotician, described as an anaphone. So could you hear those glissando strings, which the whoop sounds, and she definitely heard that as a kind of knife sharpening, and we can hear the thumping, and it's all very obvious. So by 11, children are very sophisticated listeners. They've absorbed all these codes. And it seems that young people between the ages of 10 to 12 were particularly likely to daydream to music, making up these fantasy scenarios that were narratives. So we call that storying to music. So I'm going to go to a different one, Aware of the Time Passing, and I'll just play a bit of the music first. This is again going to be some sort of fantasy thing.
Bass.
So we get the idea, and we might wonder about the type of musical daydream which is accompanying this. Okay, this is a repeating daydream. It was described in an interview. It has slight variants, but the person used it constantly as a point of reference in their life. So again, I'm sorry about the amount of text on that screen. I have to admit, I was quite surprised by this interview when this suddenly came out. So once again, we can see the links between the musical characteristics, the sort of coding there, and the daydream. So this is actually a 17-year-old, John, as he's called, in the study, and I think it's a clear example of a dissociative daydream. He talks about an alternate world, he talks about not liking his world a lot, and accessing through music other things. And actually in the study we found that boys were more likely to use music in a way of accessing, that somehow it framed, it facilitated, it scaffolded experience in this way. So alternate realities, unlike the younger age group, these kind of daydreams are more likely to be autobiographical, to do with the self, not a fantasy self, but well, kind of, but still more recognisably a self. And they weren't necessarily a narrative, they're more dreamlike, really. So, flicking onwards. I wanted to include one example, no music for this one, to show what I mean about multimodal daydreaming being internally and externally focused. So this is Alice, who's 16, and I've mentioned travel already, and this time we've got a musical daydream when somebody is walking along and they are reimagining a video. So we've got this mixture of remembered impressions from the video, that sort of imaginative side of things, but at the same time she is still aware of what's in front of her, and that is part of the experience. We can't, however, say that those elements of the imagining inside the video and what she's seeing, brick walls and wheelie bins, they're not interacting, but they're all present in experience. And in fact, I haven't included that bit, but from what she was saying about that, there was almost a preternatural quality with what she was seeing externally. So we might even talk about the combination of kinds of consciousness with an extended consciousness here, with access to long-term memory, combined with a phenomenal awareness, with this heightening of sense impressions. So the bins and brick walls looked quite preternatural, altered in her mind. Flicking onwards, I also wanted to include, it's really for debate this, I class this, these two as types of musical daydream, but here we haven't got any imagery. These are daydreams where we go to the point of non-thought. So they are instances really equivalent to something that William James described as spontaneous vacancy. We could say that they were dissociative, where young people are listening to music as a form of escape, but an escape from identity and aspects of self, and maybe an escape just from the emotionalism that happens through adolescence. The second example there is somebody that was very into the dance music culture, who talked about disappearing through music to the point of non-thought. In his case, this actually was a style of listening he rejected. So maybe we're on the edge of something which becomes an unhealthy form of using music to daydream. This actually was a component which it's one thing that served to break up his marriage, in his case. And so he decided to have a different style of music listening and living, so it was quite interesting. So coming to the end of this talk, starting to wrap things up, but thinking of yesterday's discussions a bit, I think some interesting directions. One is chronobiology. So looking at time of day and the influence of biological rhythms on experience is quite fascinating. I recently came across, because we're editing the second volume on music and consciousness at the moment for AUP, and Freya Bales had submitted a chapter on involuntary musical imagery, and she looked a little bit at time of day. There's not a lot of information about this at the moment. In Freya's study, the involuntary musical imagery seemed to be most frequent between 11 a.m. and 1. But I don't know about that. So certainly it occurred at times of low diffuse attention or attentional overload. So we know about the circadian 24-hour rhythm, but the ultradian rhythms are really of interest. So these were rhythms that were first identified. I don't know if people have come across the work of Nathaniel Kleitman, who discovered the REM cycle in sleep, so that every 90 minutes this sort of rapid eye movement would accord with dreaming. And what Kleitman did was propose that the same cycle is there in waking life. This is still a theorization. It's still a theorization with very few studies. So what we might expect is that mind wandering would increase at these times, these rest phases of this basic rest activity cycle. So maybe something of interest, but quite difficult to tap. Another interesting thing, and I mentioned it at the beginning, I said I'd try to compare musical and non-musical involving experiences. And I think these are quite interesting because they both involve mind wandering. And sometimes, and what I found in the study was that with activities, and what sort of things am I talking about? Well, the things people described were looking at cracks in the ceiling. They might be digging something, the allotment, they might be chopping wood. And sometimes with those very repetitive activities, that led as a platform for a sort of induction into a musical daydream or wandering away. Now those daydreams seem to take two forms. Sometimes they just pared down to a basic awareness on task. I wonder whether I know I've had that with some things, where it seems as if your thoughts are kind of stilled, but maybe you're more aware of sense impressions. So if you're doing something like knitting, and actually quite a few in the study, jazz musicians playing at function gigs would be totally zoned out with this, just sort of listening to the sounds but not listening. And then the second form of experience where you have an induction into daydreaming through whatever you're doing or listening to, but then you wander away. So what you're thinking about is not connected. And I think it might be useful to see what's happening in the interrelationship between whatever the stimulus attributes are of the task and the content of the daydreams. So on now to the conclusions, just to wrap this up. So I guess the main takeaway that I'm offering here is the idea of multimodal music daydreams involving a distributed attention, so this mesh of internal and external impacts, which is backed up by this ecological model of music listening, so the systemic interaction between perceiver and affordances of music and environment. So I don't know about the term mind wandering. It's great for some things, but what do we apply it to and what do we not apply it to? Is all evoked visual imagery, can it be understood as a mind wandering or musical daydreaming? Individuals, of course, demonstrate a holistic response to music. It's very difficult to disentangle the role of specific musical properties. So, for instance, the role of valence or tempo or arousal. Enculturation is obviously crucial. There are implications regarding these applications of music in well-being and health. So we all want to get a practical application out here, but it needs to be quite focused. And I was really inspired by Rebecca's talk yesterday, actually. That's all sorts of things coming out of that and other studies around that. We get spontaneous and volitional practices, very important there. Sometimes you can have volitional visual imagery. And these musical daydreams, mind wandering, can take different forms where the stimulus might be at the core of the experience or it might be at the periphery. So maybe some areas for continued and future research, I think the idea of self-chosen music plus experimenter-selected musical stimuli is a good one. I think the comparison of musical and non-musical stimuli, which I've talked about, is fruitful. The chronobiological perspectives, not sure how to tap that one. More about the influence of age and training on experience. Musical mind-wandering in naturalistic settings, and the linking of subjective and objective measures, such as brain imaging and self-report, seem fruitful directions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ruth. This was really great overview. Everything we discussed so far came together really nicely. And also you gave this very rich overview of the qualia, of the phenomenon. So that was really useful and helpful.
Thank you.
So let's take some questions.
Is it on? Oh, great. Hello. Thank you for the presentation, first of all. And it was interesting. I just have a question regarding the participant.
Sure.
Did you have to? You mentioned some sort of where you have your participants from, but did they
Okay, yeah, I didn't talk about that. I knew I was limited time, but Young People in Music Study, 625 participants for the online questionnaire, which tapped personality characteristics and characteristics of absorption. In the qualitative, the reports, the descriptions of everyday experience, there were 60 so participants. That was an awful lot of data, because normally in that sort of qualitative research we used interpretative phenomenological analysis to analyse. You would not go for 60 people. It was enormously difficult to process. And then with the lab-based study, when they were listening to those excerpts, there were 90. And that was evenly matched, 45 boys, 45 girls.
Hi, thank you so much for this. This was amazing. I also really enjoyed the specific examples because it really brings it to life. And one term you used really sort of triggered me, and you mentioned musical codes or associative codes,
Yeah.
right? And this idea that I mean, clearly, as you mentioned, you pre-selected these excerpts to elicit something, right? You have some idea
Sure,
that
yeah.
it's going to do something. But I'm fascinated by how we decode this meaning, right? Because it feels like what it comes down to is really the meaning in music and this link to semantic concepts.
Of course.
And would you be willing to speculate or free associate a bit about how these codes come into existence? Like, how do people start to build these representations?
Okay, so we're really going into several areas at once. So,
Yeah.
I mean, one thing that's put forward is this sort of sedimentation of meaning, so that over hundreds of years you get things that are kind of go within the culture and into the culture. Another area is the semiotics thing, and I have presented some of this material at semiotics conferences, which is quite interesting to see people's take on it. So we would acquire these associative codes just from a pairing of a musical stimulus with something external, and that happens consistently over time. This is described in several different books on musical development, so there's that aspect to it. I couldn't do a talk around that meaning thing, and I should have said that that study is just out in Psychology of Music, so in print copy May, so there's more information there.
That's great. That's great.
Yeah,
Thank you
okay.
so much. Yeah.
Okay, so thank you very much once
Thank you.
again, Ruth.
Thanks.